The fluorescent lights of the Bureau of Absurd Affairs flickered in an oddly rhythmic pulse, as if in time with the heartbeat of a world where nonsense was no longer an anomaly but a way of life. Eliza Quill stood at the center of the chaos, her fingers stained with ink and her mind alight with a plan that defied every principle she once held sacred. The old ways, the endless forms, the inflexible rules had proven insufficient to contain the surging tide of absurdity that the Bureau now faced. If nonsense was to be regulated at all, it had to be embraced in all its unpredictable glory. "We're not just managing chaos," Eliza said, addressing a room filled with clerks and advisors. "We're learning to dance with it." Mira talk, her hair a riotous splash of color against the drab gray of the office, sketched furiously in her ever-present notebook. "Imagine a festival," she said, eyes sparkling, "where misplaced Mondays are celebrated rather than feared, where people can revel in the unexpected and the impossible without waiting for a permit." Harold Pindle adjusted his oversized spectacles, his normally rigid posture softened by the weight of new regulations sprawled across his desk. "Flexible," he muttered, "but still within bounds. We can't let this slip into anarchy." Carl Tannen, the legal mind behind the convoluted regulations, nodded thoughtfully. "The laws must evolve, they must breathe, like the creatures we regulate." Felix Grimble, ever the eccentric archivist, shuffled through a mountain of files, pausing to pull out a curious, dust-covered tome. "There's magic in these pages," he said softly, "a kind of bureaucratic enchantment that once stabilized the most unruly of nonsenses. Perhaps it can help us again." Nina Voss, the technician, tapped a spanner against a humming absurdity machine, its gears sputtering but still alive. "If we can repair these," she said, "we can control the chaos, not by suppression but by collaboration." The Bureau was alive with energy, a fusion of old and new, of order and whimsy. Eliza took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a mantle. The paradox of their existence was no longer a problem to solve, but a promise to keep. The dance between order and absurdity was eternal, and they were its choreographers. As the day wore on, the clerks implemented the new procedures. Forms were redesigned to include spaces for creative expression. Time travel licenses now came with a clause encouraging unexpected detours. Unicorn parking permits allowed for spontaneous celebrations in unauthorized zones. Misplaced Mondays became the highlight of the calendar, with Myra spearheading public art installations and impromptu performances. Harold watched, initially skeptical, as the office hummed with a new kind of life. His fear of losing control wrestled with a reluctant admiration for the beauty unfolding before him. "Perhaps," he whispered to himself, "there is method in this madness." Eliza caught his eye and smiled, a rare gesture that spoke of shared understanding. "It's not about control," she said quietly. "It's about coexistence." Outside, the city pulsed with the laughter of citizens embracing the absurd. The Bureau, once a fortress of paperwork and rules, had become a beacon of creative regulation. The impossible was no longer a threat, but a treasure. Yet, in the quiet corners of the office, subtle glimmers of uncertainty remained. The auditor's shadow lingered, a reminder that the battle between chaos and order was far from over. But for now, the clerks reveled in their hard-won harmony, knowing that the dance continued ever unpredictable, ever vital. And as the sun set behind the city skyline, casting long, surreal shadows over the Bureau of Absurd Affairs, Eliza mused aloud, "What's next?" Mira grinned, flipping to a fresh page in her sketchbook. Whatever nonsense decides to be, the dance went on. In the grey dawn of a city that thrived on nonsense, the Bureau of Absurd Affairs awoke to a storm. The usual hum of fluorescent lights and the soft clatter of keyboards was pierced by an unrelenting chorus of news alerts and social media uproar. Juno Sparks, the Bureau's most persistent and sardonic investigator, had released her latest expose, and it was a bombshell. The article, titled Paperwork or Folly, inside the Bureau of Absurd Affairs, spread like wildfire. Juno's words were sharp, her tone unyielding. She described the Bureau as a Kafkaesque labyrinth of contradictory rules, whimsical mandates, and bureaucratic inertia. With a mixture of wit and scathing critique, she exposed the tangled webs of time travel licenses, unicorn parking permits, and the baffling phenomenon of misplaced Mondays that the clerks manage daily. She questioned the sanity and necessity of regulating nonsense, painting the Bureau as both a guardian and a prisoner of absurdity. The press conference announcing the expose was a spectacle. Juno stood under the harsh glare of camera flashes, her red hair a vibrant beacon against the backdrop of grim-faced reporters. Her voice rang out clear and uncompromising as she answered questions, weaving anecdotes from clandestine interviews with clerks and leaked documents that revealed internal conflicts and procedural chaos. The public was captivated, divided between amusement, disbelief, and genuine concern. Back inside the Bureau, the impact was immediate and palpable. Eliza Quill sat at her cluttered desk, the glow of her cracked monitor illuminating her face as she read the headline for the third time. Her fingers, perpetually stained with ink from frantic note-taking and form-filling, clenched reflexively around a time travel permit. The words on the screen echoed her own conflicted thoughts. Was their work a noble defense of the impossible, or merely a farce wrapped in red tape? Harold Pindle's office was a stark contrast, a sanctuary of order in the chaos. Yet even here, tension seeped through the walls. Harold paced anxiously, clutching a sheaf of unicorn parking permits as if they were lifelines. His slicked-back grey hair seemed more disheveled than usual, and his oversized spectacles glinted with worry. Nearby, Myratok sat cross-legged on the floor, her brightly colored hair a splash of rebellion amid the dull palette of bureaucratic despair. She doodled whimsical creatures on a notepad, her sketches a silent protest against the mounting pressure. "They don't understand," Harold muttered, his voice tight. "We keep things from spiraling into chaos. Without us, the city would be overrun by unregulated nonsense." Mira shrugged, her eyes sparkling with mischievous defiance. "Or maybe they're just tired of the nonsense we call order. Maybe it's time for something new." Felix Grimble and Nina Voss were a study in contrast. Felix, with his colorful bow ties and spectacles perched low on his nose, shuffled through piles of files with a distracted cheerfulness that belied the urgency of the moment. Nina, practical and focused, adjusted the settings on a malfunctioning absurdity machine, her grease-stained hands moving with precise determination. Together, they whispered plans and theories, their unlikely alliance a beacon of hope amid the swirling uncertainty. "We have to show them what the Bureau really does," Felix said, eyes twinkling behind his glasses. "Not just the paperwork, but the magic beneath." The public debate raged on. Some saw the Bureau as a necessary absurdity, a quirky but vital safeguard that protected the city's delicate balance between reality and nonsense. Others viewed it as an outdated, costly relic clinging desperately to power in a world that demanded rationality and order. Carl Tannen, the legal advisor, found himself drafting new statements and clarifications amid the chaos, his conservative demeanor strained by the need to adapt. Greta Loop, the receptionist, fielded a flood of ridiculous requests and angry calls, her dry wit a small comfort to both callers and clerks alike. As the day wore on, the clerks gathered in the break room, a motley group united by shared confusion and determination. Eliza, her voice steady despite the turmoil, addressed them. "This isn't just about us," she said. "It's about what nonsense means to this city, and maybe to all of us. We've seen what happens when order is imposed without room for chaos. We have to find a way to show the world that nonsense isn't the problem, it's the solution." Harold nodded reluctantly, and Mira grinned, already sketching plans for a public art installation celebrating absurdity. Felix hummed a forgotten tune, and Nina tinkered quietly with her machines, readying them for the next challenge. Outside, the city continued its strange dance, a place where misplaced Mondays might still wander. Unicorns sought parking, and time travelers queued for permits. Under the glare of the public eye, the Bureau of Absurd Affairs braced for its next act, a blend of bemused frustration and hopeful absurdity that was, after all, its very essence. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the city's surreal skyline, the question lingered in the air. Could the Bureau survive the scrutiny, or would the absurd finally be silenced? The dance was far from over. The air inside the archive room was thick with dust, and the faint hum of antiquated absurdity machines, their rhythmic pulses a steady backdrop to Felix Grimble's clumsy rummaging. His colourful bow tie was askew, and spectacles perched precariously low on his nose as he sifted through decades-old files. Each folder a testament to the Bureau's tangled history of nonsense regulation. Beside him, Nina Voss crouched by a humming machine, her grease-stained fingers deftly probing its intricate innards. The technician's brow furrowed in concentration as she whispered theories about glitches possibly engineered, not accidental. "Felix," Nina murmured, her voice barely audible amid the mechanical symphony. "Look at this encrypted signals embedded in the machine's diagnostic logs. They're communicating, but not with us." Felix adjusted his glasses, leaning closer to the screen flickering with coded sequences. External regulators. But that's impossible. The Bureau is the sole authority on nonsense. "Apparently not," Nina replied, her eyes sharp. "The Auditors faction has been reaching out beyond these walls. They're recruiting allies who want to purge the chaos from society altogether." A chill ran down Felix's spine, not from the cold, but from the implications. The delicate balance they'd struggled to maintain was under siege, not just internally, but from outside forces wielding cold, unyielding logic. Later that day, the cramped conference room buzzed with a different energy. The flickering fluorescent lights cast elongated shadows over the cluttered table where Eliza, Quill, Harold, Pindle, and Myra Tock gathered. Permit forms, cryptic notes, and hastily sketched diagrams lay strewn about like battlefield maps. Felix cleared his throat, pulling up the decrypted communications on the central screen. These messages confirm if the Auditors faction has allies outside the Bureau. They're coordinating efforts to dismantle our regulation of nonsense. Harold's face paled, fingers twitching nervously as he adjusted his ill-fitting suit. "But that threatens everything we've built. Order, procedure." Mira's eyes sparkled with a different fire. "It threatens the magic, too. The freedom to be absurd. We can't let that happen." Eliza folded her arms, the familiar ink stains on her fingers catching the light. "We've been fractured, doubting each other. But now, we have to unite. Bureaucracy and creativity both are our weapons." Outside, the sharp wind carried the distant murmur of protests inspired by Myra's grassroots movement. The city was awakening to the absurdity that the Bureau protected. But the threat looming from the auditor's faction darkened the horizon. Within the bureau, preparations accelerated. The clerks harnessed their combined skills, Harold's meticulous record-keeping, Eliza's calm strategic mind, Myra's imaginative flair, Felix's archival knowledge, and Nina's technical prowess. Each plan was a dance between order and chaos, a delicate choreography aimed at preserving the bureau's essence. As night fell, Felix and Nina found themselves alone in the dimly lit break room. The city's distant hum softened, replaced by the gentle ticking of absurdity machines, an oddly comforting metronome. Felix stirred his tea thoughtfully. "Do you think we can really resist?" Nina smiled faintly, a spark of whimsy in her eyes. "We're the Bureau of Absurd Affairs. If anyone can, it's us." They sat in quiet solidarity, the weight of their discovery heavy but tempered by the fragile hope that comes from standing together. Outside, the dance between order and absurdity continued, and the Bureau braced for the storm ahead. The chapter closed with the Bureau's unlikely allies forging a pact not just to defend paperwork and permits, but to protect the very spirit of nonsense that made their world worth regulating. The war for absurdity's future was just beginning, and the clerks were ready to fight with wit, creativity, and the peculiar magic only bureaucracy could conjure. The day began like any other at the Bureau of Absurd Affairs, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as clerks shuffled through their mountain of nonsensical paperwork. But beneath the mundane hum of bureaucracy, a subtle tremor was growing, one that would soon shake the very foundations of nonsense regulation. Nina Voss stood in the dimly lit control room, her hands moving deftly over the consoles that monitored the absurdity machines, those curious contraptions responsible for maintaining the delicate balance of impossibility across the city. Her brow furrowed as a sudden cascade of warning lights flickered erratically. "Not again," she muttered, the faint smell of ozone prickling her nostrils. Sparks crackled from one of the panels, sending a shower of blue-white light across the room. The machines, usually reliable in their chaotic logic, were failing. Time itself began to unravel in subtle, unsettling ways. Nina's fingers danced over the controls, trying to stabilize the cascading failures. But every adjustment seemed to deepen the paradox. Meanwhile, in the main office, Eliza Quill sat at her desk, meticulously reviewing a time travel license application. She glanced up as the clocks on the wall suddenly spun backwards, their hands whirling in dizzying circles. A misplaced Monday slipped through the calendar again, materializing on her desk like an unwelcome visitor. Her calm, usually impenetrable, faltered as she caught sight of a unicorn pacing impatiently near the water cooler. An unauthorized appearance due to the parking permit chaos. "What in the bureaucratic blazes?" Eliza whispered, pushing up her glasses, fingers twitching as she reached for a temporal recalibrator. But the device sparked and fizzled, refusing to cooperate. Across the room, Harold Pindle's usual composed demeanor cracked under pressure. His eyes darted between forms, each stamped with more errors than the last. He barked orders at the bewildered unicorns wandering the office, his voice rising in panic. No, that's the restricted zone. Move along." His oversized spectacles slid down his nose as he frantically tried to restore order, but the neat rows of paperwork were dissolving into chaos. Myra Talk, ever the whirlwind of energy, was a bright splash of color amid the turmoil. Her hair, a kaleidoscope of hues, bounced as she sketched feverishly in her ever-present notebook. Her whimsical creatures seemed to dance across the pages, a stark contrast to the crumbling order around her. "Maybe the madness is the point," she mused aloud, her eyes gleaming with wild inspiration. Felix Grimble shuffled in, colourful bow tie askew, spectacles perched precariously at the tip of his nose. He muttered incantations under his breath, fragments of forgotten magic from his days as a stage magician. If bureaucratic paperwork can be magic, perhaps real magic can fix paperwork, he joked, though a glimmer of hope shone in his eyes. As the absurdity machines faltered, the fabric of nonsense stretched thin. Time loops tangled, misplaced Mondays multiplied, and the city itself teetered on the edge of an impossible collapse. The bureau's clerks found themselves not just managing paperwork, but fighting to preserve the very essence of the bizarre world they governed. Eliza gathered the team in the cramped conference room, the air thick with tension and the faint scent of burnt circuitry. "We're at a breaking point," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil. "If we don't act fast, the entire system could unravel." Harold swallowed hard, his rigid resolve wavering. But what if? What if the rules themselves are part of the problem? Mira's grin was infectious. Then maybe it's time to rewrite them. Felix nodded, his magical mumblings growing louder. Sometimes, the most absurd solutions are the only ones that work. Nina's fingers flew over the controls one last time, sending a surge of power into the failing machines. The alarms ceased, the light steadied, and a fragile calm returned. But the crisis had left its mark. The bureau was changed, its clerks forever altered by the chaos they'd survived. They understood now that nonsense was not simply disorder to be managed, but a vital force to be embraced and nurtured. As the team dispersed, Eliza lingered by the window, watching a unicorn vanish into the city's mist. She whispered to herself, quoting a line from obscure absurdist literature, "We must love the chaos if we are to master it." Outside, the city pulsed with the strange heartbeat of nonsense, unpredictable, unruly, and utterly alive. The breaking point had passed, but the dance between order and absurdity was far from over. And somewhere in the shadows, the mirrored mask of the auditor gleamed, watching, waiting for the next move. The bureau's future hung in the balance. A precarious tightrope stretched between logic and lunacy, with every clerk poised to step forward or fall back into the abyss of reason. Yet even in the darkest moments, hope flickered, a stubborn, improbable light refusing to be extinguished. The dance continued. Eliza Quill stood motionless in the dim glow of the bureau's control room, the low hum of malfunctioning absurdity monitors filling the silence like the uneasy heartbeat of a faltering organism. Each blinking light and flickering screen signaled a fracture in the delicate balance she had sworn to maintain. Time travel licenses were misfiring, misplaced Mondays multiplied unchecked, and unicorn parking spots overflowed beyond their designated zones. The very fabric of nonsense itself was unraveling. Around her, the familiar walls of the Bureau of Absurd Affairs felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage tightening. With every paradox and procedural failure, her fingers perpetually stained with ink from the endless forms she processed, trembled slightly as she reached for the latest reporter dossier detailing a rogue time travel permit that had already caused 3 temporal anomalies and threatened to erase a minor league baseball game from existence. The absurdity of it was almost laughable, if not for the creeping dread that this was just the beginning. "Eliza," a voice broke through her reverie. Harold Pindle appeared in the doorway, his slicked back grey hair slightly mussed, oversized spectacles slipping down his nose. His expression was a mixture of worry and rigid resolve. "We must clamp down harder. If we don't enforce the rules without exception, everything will descend into chaos." She turned to face him, her gaze steady but weary. "Harold, the chaos is already here. The rules aren't enough anymore. We need to rethink how we manage nonsense. Harold's lips pressed into a thin line. Rethink, that's a slippery slope. Without order, there's only anarchy. We are the gatekeepers. Before Eliza could respond, the sound of rapid footsteps echoed down the corridor. Myra Tock burst into the room, her brightly colored hair almost glowing under the fluorescent lights, sketchbook clutched tightly. Order isn't the only way. Sometimes you have to let the absurd breathe to keep it alive. The three of them stood there: Eliza, the pragmatic skeptic; Harold, the rule-obsessed guardian; and Mira, the whimsical rebel, each embodying a facet of the Bureau's fractured soul. "I've been working on a new approach," Eliza began cautiously, "one that blends structure with spontaneity. We can't just enforce nonsense. We have to embrace it, guide it without suffocating it." Harold shook his head. "Guidance is a euphemism for chaos. I won't let this place become a circus." Their argument was interrupted by an unnatural chill settling over the room. The auditor had arrived. The stoic figure in the black suit stood silently at the threshold, faceless behind a mirrored mask that reflected the flickering lights and the anxious faces before him. Without a word, he extended a gloved hand holding a document stamped with the seal of ultra-rational order. "This is your final warning." The auditor's voice echoed coldly, devoid of emotion but heavy with threat. "Cease this folly of nonsense regulation. Eliminate absurdity, and society will progress unhindered." Eliza's heart pounded, but her voice remained steady. Nonsense is not folly. It's the pulse of creativity, the breath of imagination. Without it, this Bureau, the world, loses its soul. The auditor's mirrored mask seemed to flicker momentarily, as if reflecting a hidden turmoil. Then, turning sharply, he departed, leaving a silence that weighed heavier than any words. In the days that followed, the Bureau was gripped by tension and uncertainty. Felix Grimble, the eccentric archivist with his kaleidoscope of bow ties, rummaged through dusty files and ancient permits, searching for forgotten wisdom. Nina Voss, grease-stained and focused, worked tirelessly to stabilize the absurdity machines, her sharp eyes catching every irregular pulse. Eliza found herself at her desk late one night, the world outside the Bureau's windows swallowed by darkness. The only light came from her desk lamp, casting long shadows over her ink-stained fingers as they danced across the paper. She wrote feverishly, sketching out a manifesto that would redefine the Bureau's purpose, the blueprint for a future where order and chaos coexisted in a dynamic, delicate balance. Her thoughts wandered to the past, the misplaced Tuesdays, the rogue licenses, the endless forms that both tethered and liberated the strangest city office in existence. She remembered the quote she often muttered in moments of stress: "From an obscure, absurdist poet, to regulate the impossible is to dance with shadows on the edge of reason." The choice before her was clear yet daunting. Cling to the brittle safety of rigid bureaucracy, risking collapse under the weight of its own contradictions, or leap into the unknown, embracing the unpredictable heartbeat of nonsense, and trust that from chaos, new order might emerge. As dawn crept over the horizon, painting the city in hues of orange and rose, Eliza sealed her manifesto with a decisive stroke. The Bureau's future, and perhaps the future of absurdity itself, rested on the fragile promise of a dance that would never end. "Let the dance continue," she whispered, a faint smile touching her lips, "but this time we lead with open hands." Outside, the first misplaced Monday in weeks winked into existence, its chaotic presence heralding the beginning of a new chapter for the Bureau of Absurd Affairs. And so, At the crossroads of fate, Eliza Quill chose not between order and chaos, but for the harmony that can only be born when the two embrace. The journey ahead was uncertain. The rules